My youngest son, an airline pilot, called to ask if my daughter-in-law was at home. I replied, "Yes, she is here." He whispered, "Impossible. She just boarded my flight." Then I heard footsteps behind me. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Sarah, and my world is painted in the quiet, gentle colors of a life well lived. At 67, my days are measured not by the clock but by the familiar rhythms of family. The morning sun slanting through the kitchen window of my home in a peaceful California suburb, the scent of coffee brewing, the sound of my older son Daniel's car starting as he heads to his architecture firm, and the sweet, high-pitched chatter of my grandson Sam before the school bus arrives. These are the pillars of my contentment. This Tuesday morning was no different. The house had settled into its mid-morning quiet. Daniel and Sam were gone, leaving behind only the pleasant echoes of their morning rush. My daughter-in-law Isabel was upstairs. She was the picture of effortless grace, a woman who managed her home, her child, and her life with a polish that I, from a generation of more frantic motherhood, could only admire. Her voice, melodious and clear, floated down the staircase. "Sarah, I'm just hopping in for a quick shower. Take your time, dear," I called back, smiling to myself as I tidied the breakfast dishes. It was in this bubble of domestic peace that the telephone rang, its sharp trill slicing through the quiet. I dried my hands on my apron and answered, expecting a call from my book club or perhaps a neighbor. "Mom?" The voice was my youngest son's, Leo's, but it was stripped of its usual cheerful warmth. It was tight, urgent, and pitched low. Leo was an airline pilot, my adventurer, the son who had traded a life on the ground for one in the clouds. His calls were usually a whirlwind of updates from far-flung cities, filled with laughter and stories. This was different. "Leo? Honey, is everything all right?" I asked, a knot of maternal worry instantly tightening in my stomach. "I'm fine, Mom, but I have a strange question." He paused, and I could hear the faint impersonal chime of an airport PA system in the background. "Is Isabel at the house right now?" I glanced toward the stairs, where the faint sound of running water from the upstairs bathroom had just started. I laughed, the tension in my chest easing. "Of course, she is. She just got in the shower not 2 minutes ago. Why do you ask?" The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, profound. I could hear him take a sharp, incredulous breath. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper, a thread of sound so taut with disbelief it felt like it could snap. "Mom, that's impossible." "What do you mean, impossible?" I said, my own voice wavering now. "I just spoke to her." "No," he whispered, the word sharp and final. "I'm standing at the gate at LAX. I'm looking right at her. She just boarded my flight to Paris." The world tilted on its axis. The familiar sunlit kitchen seemed to warp and bend around me. The laws of physics suddenly suspended. My mind scrambled, trying to find a logical explanation. A look-alike, a misunderstanding. But Leo's voice was laced with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. He knew his own sister-in-law. My throat went dry. "Leo, you must be mistaken." But I never finished the sentence, because at that exact moment, I heard it. A sound so soft, so mundane, yet so utterly terrifying in its implication. The soft tread of footsteps on the stairs behind me. I froze, my hand clutching the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare to turn around. The sound of the shower was still running upstairs, a distant mocking hiss. The footsteps descended, one by one, deliberate and unhurried. A voice, Isabel's voice, spoke from just behind my shoulder, soft and sweet. "Who was that on the phone, Sarah?" I slammed the receiver down, cutting off Leo's frantic whispers. My heart was a wild, panicked bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I turned around slowly, every muscle in my body screaming. There she was. A woman who looked in every conceivable way like my daughter-in-law. She was wrapped in a plush white towel, another smaller one turbaned around her head, her skin glowing and damp, but her hair, what I could see of it, wasn't wet. It was perfectly dry. "Just a friend," I stammered, my voice a croak. "Wrong number." She smiled, a perfectly pleasant, placid smile, but her eyes were different. They held a placid emptiness, a hollow quality I had never seen in the vibrant, expressive eyes of the woman I knew as Isabel. I was sharing a house with a stranger who was wearing my daughter-in-law's face. Throughout the rest of that long, surreal day, The woman moved through my home with a quiet confidence that was itself a form of violation. She was a perfect mimic, a ghost in the machine of our family's life. She made lunch. She tidied the living room. She performed all the small mundane tasks of Isabel's day. But the performance was flawed, filled with tiny dissonant notes that only I who knew the original score by heart could hear. When she reorganized the bookshelf in the den, she did it alphabetically by author. I knew for a fact that Isabel arranged her books by color, a chaotic but visually pleasing system that Daniel always teased her about. This woman's methodical organization was a jarring foreign element in the familiar landscape of my home. Later, when she was setting the table for dinner, she hummed a tune I didn't recognize, a somber, classical piece. Isabel always hummed pop songs from the radio, slightly off-key. The difference was as subtle and as profound as the difference between a real flower and a perfect silk replica. The most jarring moment came when Sam, my grandson, burst through the door from school. A whirlwind of 5-year-old energy. He ran to the woman, his arms outstretched. "Mommy." She knelt and hugged him, a picture-perfect image of maternal affection. "Hey there, buddy," she said, ruffling his hair. "How was school?" My blood ran cold. Buddy. Isabel had a dozen pet names for Sam. Sammy, Sweet Pea, my little tiger, but never, not once in his life, had she called him Buddy. It was a generic, impersonal term, and it landed with a thud in the warm, specific world of their relationship. I saw a flicker of confusion in Sam's eyes before he launched into a story about his day, the strangeness of the moment already forgotten by his young mind, but not by me. I felt a creeping, stomach-churning dread. This was not a simple case of a mistaken identity on Leo's part. This was something else, something carefully orchestrated and deeply wrong. I was trapped in my own home, forced to play along with a terrifying charade, making polite conversation with an imposter while the real mother of my grandson was, according to my son, on a plane to France. And the most terrifying part was not knowing why. The first concrete clue, the first piece of tangible evidence that I wasn't losing my mind, came from a can opener. It was an old manual one that Daniel and Isabel had never bothered to replace. The next afternoon, the woman, I couldn't bring myself to think of her as Isabel, was in the kitchen preparing to make a tuna salad for lunch. I watched from the doorway as she took the can of tuna and the opener from the drawer. She clamped the device onto the rim of the can with her right hand and began to turn the handle. It was an awkward, clumsy motion. The gears slipped twice, her wrist contorting at an unnatural angle. She gritted her teeth in frustration, her brow furrowed. After a third failed attempt, she let out a sigh of annoyance and switched the can opener to her left hand. Instantly, the motion became fluid, natural, and efficient. The blade bit into the metal and the lid came off in a smooth, clean circle. She didn't seem to notice the significance of the action, but for me it was a thunderclap. Isabel was staunchly, unequivocally right-handed. I had seen her sign birthday cards, chop vegetables, swing a tennis racket, and paint a nursery wall, always with her right hand. I had never once seen her use her left hand for any task requiring dexterity. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had to ask. I had to see how she would explain it. I walked into the kitchen, forcing a casual smile onto my face. "Having trouble with that old thing?" I asked, nodding toward the can opener. "I noticed you switched hands. I never knew you were ambidextrous." The woman looked up, and for a split second I saw that same flash of panic I'd seen in her eyes the day before. It was a flicker of a cornered animal, quickly suppressed and hidden behind a bright, brittle smile. "Oh, this old thing," she said, laughing a little too loudly. "No, not ambidextrous. I've been reading about neuroplasticity. You know how using your non-dominant hand can build new pathways in the brain. Just trying to keep my brain active, using the other side." The excuse was plausible, even intelligent, but it was too quick, too perfectly formed. It was a pre-rehearsed line, a shield to deflect suspicion. A person genuinely experimenting with their non-dominant hand would have likely said, "Oh, I'm just trying something new," not launched into a mini-lecture on neuroscience. The lie was as smooth and polished as a river stone, and just as cold. The confirmation of my fears came later that day, from the one person in the house whose honesty was absolute, my grandson. Sam was in his room, playing with his vast collection of plastic dinosaurs. I sat on the floor with him, helping him arrange them into a fearsome prehistoric battle. The woman came into the room, a plate of sliced apples in her hand. "Snack time, Sammy," she said, her voice filled with a practiced maternal warmth. Sam looked up. his face a mask of confusion. "You called me Sammy," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Of course I did, sweet pea," she said, her smile faltering slightly. "That's your name." "No," Sam said, his 5-year-old logic direct and unassailable. "Yesterday you called me Buddy. You don't call me Sammy." He turned back to his dinosaurs, the conversation over in his mind, but the woman stood frozen in the doorway, the plate of apples trembling in her hand. She had made a mistake. She had mixed up her notes, forgotten a detail from the script she was performing. Later that evening, after the woman had tucked him into bed, Sam padded into my room, his favorite stuffed dinosaur, a green T-Rex with a wobbly eye, clutched in his hand. He looked up at me, his small face serious and troubled. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mommy's hugs feel different today." I pulled him onto my lap, my heart aching. "Different how, sweet pea?" "I don't know," he said, frowning as he tried to find the words. "They're not as squeezy," and she didn't remember the name of my favorite dinosaur. He held up the T-Rex. She called him Dino. "His name is Rex." He laid his head against my chest, a small, warm weight of confusion and sadness. I held him tightly, stroking his hair, my mind reeling. This imposter, this stranger, could mimic Isabel's appearance, her voice, her mannerisms, but she couldn't replicate the 1,000 tiny specific details that make up the intimate bond between a mother and child. She didn't know the right nickname, the right level of squeeze in a hug, the name of a beloved stuffed animal. She was a forgery, and my grandson, in his innocence, was the expert who could spot the flaws. The conversation with my neighbor was the moment the dread I felt began to solidify into a terrifying concrete theory. Mrs. Gable lived 2 houses down, a sweet, retired woman, with a penchant for gardening and a keen eye for the neighborhood's comings and goings. I was watering the petunias that lined my front walkway when she ambled over, her watering can swinging at her side. "Good morning, Sarah," she said, her voice a cheerful chirp. "Your Isabel is such a busy woman. I just don't know how she does it all." I forced a smile, my stomach twisting. "Oh? What do you mean, Helen?" "Well, just yesterday afternoon," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with admiration. "I saw her getting into one of those fancy black town cars right out front. She was wearing the most stunning red dress, looked like she was heading to a gala in the city. And then, I swear, not an hour later I saw her out in the backyard in her old gardening clothes, wrestling with that stubborn rosebush by the fence. The energy of that young woman, I was tired just watching her." Mrs. Gable laughed, taking a sip of the lemonade she held in her other hand. But I couldn't breathe. Her words, meant as a compliment, landed like a series of hammer blows. A red dress, a town car, and then, an hour later, gardening clothes. It was impossible. But it explained everything. There weren't 2 places, there were 2 people. The theory bloomed in my mind, a monstrous, unbelievable flower. 2 women identical in appearance, swapping places. One, the glamorous woman in the red dress, heading off to a secret life. The other, the domestic stand-in, the imposter in my house, left to perform the mundane tasks of Isabel's existence. It was a plot from a soap opera, too wild, too outlandish to be real. And yet, it was the only explanation that fit all the pieces. Leo's call from the airport, the left-handedness, the forgotten nicknames, the neighbor's impossible sighting. I managed to murmur something non-committal to Mrs. Gable, my mind a whirlwind of panic and horror. I retreated into the house, my legs unsteady. The imposter was in the kitchen, humming that same somber classical tune as she wiped down the counters. She looked up and smiled at me, a calm, pleasant, utterly fraudulent smile. How deep did this go? And where was the real Isabel? The woman on Leo's flight to Paris, drinking champagne next to a wealthy-looking man. My heart seized with a new, sharper fear. This wasn't just a strange game. This was a calculated, long-term deception. And my son Daniel was at the very center of it, a clueless victim in his own home, married to a woman who was not who she seemed to be. The financial clue appeared by accident. I was changing the linens in Daniel and Isabel's bedroom, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy while my world was tilting on its axis. As I pulled the fitted sheet from the mattress, a small, crisp piece of paper that had been tucked between the mattress and the box spring fluttered to the floor. It was a receipt. A carbon copy from a high-end boutique on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. The date was from 3 weeks ago. The item listed was a Serpenti Forever leather handbag. The price made my breath catch in my throat. $8,500. I stared at the slip of paper, my mind struggling to process the number. My son Daniel was a talented architect, but his firm was still young. They lived comfortably, but they were not wealthy. An $8,000 handbag was an impossible extravagance, a purchase so far beyond their means, it was laughable. It was more than Daniel's monthly mortgage payment. There was no way he could have afforded it, and there was no way he would have approved such a purchase. The receipt was a key unlocking another door in this labyrinth of lies. The secret life wasn't just about escaping the suburbs. It was about funding a lifestyle of incredible luxury. Later that day, I found the imposter in the living room, reading a book. I had to know what she would say. I held out the receipt, my hand trembling slightly. "I found this under the mattress, dear," I said, my voice carefully neutral. I was a bit surprised. "That's an awfully expensive handbag." She looked at the receipt, and again I saw that flicker of pure panic. She was a terrible liar, her emotions too close to the surface. She quickly composed herself, forcing a light, airy laugh.
"Oh, that old thing,"
she said, waving a dismissive hand, as if it were a receipt for a gallon of milk. "You won't believe my luck. I bought a lottery scratch ticket at the gas station a few weeks ago and won $10,000. Can you believe it? I decided to treat myself. I was going to surprise Daniel with it for our anniversary. That's why I hid the receipt." The lie was audacious, almost impressive in its boldness, but it was also flimsy, a story full of holes. If she had won $10,000, the whole family would have known about it. Isabel would have been ecstatic, shouting the news from the rooftops. She wouldn't have quietly funneled it into a secret designer purchase. The woman saw the disbelief in my eyes. Her smile faltered. "It's true," she insisted, her voice a little too sharp. I was just waiting for the right moment to tell everyone. I didn't press her. I just nodded slowly and put the receipt in my pocket. I had all the proof I needed. The woman in my house was a stand-in, and the real Isabel, my daughter-in-law, was not just on a vacation. She was living a completely separate secret life, funded by a source I couldn't begin to imagine, built on a foundation of lies so profound they had fractured the very reality of my family. And I was the only one who knew. The call from Leo came that night. He was on his layover in Paris, the city lights no doubt twinkling outside his hotel window, a world away from the quiet, suffocating darkness of my son's suburban home. His voice was low and strained, the cheerful pilot persona completely gone, replaced by the worried son. "Mom, I've been thinking about this all day," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "I'm not mistaken. It was her. I saw her up close when I was doing my pre-flight walkthrough of the cabin." "I know, Leo," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I was huddled in my bedroom, the door locked, terrified the imposter might overhear. "I believe you." I quickly recounted the events of the past 2 days. The left-handedness, Sam's confusion, the neighbor's impossible sighting, the absurdly expensive handbag, and the flimsy lottery ticket story. I told him my monstrous theory that there were 2 of them. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him processing the sheer insanity of it all. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. "It makes a sick kind of sense," he admitted. "She wasn't alone, Mom. She was in first class, seat 2A. In 2B, there was a man, looked to be in his late 50s. Silver hair, very distinguished. He was wearing a suit that was worth more than my car. They were drinking champagne before we even took off. They were talking intimately, his hand on her arm. They looked comfortable, like they'd been doing this for a long time. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place. A wealthy lover, the source of the designer handbags and the first-class flights to Paris. My daughter-in-law wasn't just deceiving her husband. She was having an affair on a scale so grand and audacious it was almost beyond comprehension. "Mom," Leo's voice was sharp with a new urgency. "This isn't just weird, it's dangerous. This man, whoever he is powerful. The woman in your house, she's part of a conspiracy. You don't know who you're dealing with. You need to be careful. Don't confront her. Not until I get back and we can figure out what to do. Promise me." "I promise," I whispered, though my heart was screaming for action. "I mean it," he insisted. "Whatever you do, don't let her know you're suspicious. Just act normal. I'll be home in 3 days. We'll handle this together." We hung up, and I sat in the darkness of my room, the phone cold in my hand. Leo's warning had amplified my fear tenfold. This wasn't just a domestic drama. This was something bigger, more calculated, and potentially more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The woman downstairs wasn't just an imposter, she was a variable in a high-stakes game I didn't understand, and I was alone in the house with her, forced to pretend that everything was normal, while the very foundation of my family was crumbling beneath my feet. My suspicion was no longer a suspicion, it was a raging fire. Fueled by Leo's confirmation and the mounting pile of inconsistencies, I knew I couldn't just sit and wait. Leo's warning to be careful echoed in my ears, but the protective instinct of a mother and grandmother was a far more powerful force. I had to find definitive proof, something tangible I could show Daniel, something that would shatter the elaborate illusion Isabel had constructed. I waited until the next afternoon, when the imposter announced she was going to the grocery store. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I began my search. I felt like a burglar in my own son's home, my heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and grim determination. I started in their master bedroom, my hands shaking as I went through drawers and closets. Everything seemed normal. Isabel's clothes, her jewelry, her books. But I was looking for something that was out of place, something that didn't belong to the life of a suburban mom. I moved to the storage closet at the end of the upstairs hallway. A place filled with old winter coats, forgotten sports equipment and boxes of seasonal decorations. It was musty and dark, smelling of mothballs and time. I pushed aside a row of heavy coats, their wool scratching against my arms, and there, tucked away in the deepest, darkest corner, I saw it. It wasn't a box. It was a small, exquisitely crafted leather carry-on suitcase. It was a brand I'd only seen in glossy magazines, the kind of luggage that costs a small fortune. It didn't belong with the dusty ski boots and the faded Christmas ornaments. With trembling fingers I pulled the suitcase out and laid it on the floor. The latches clicked open with a satisfying expensive sound. My breath caught in my throat. The contents were a glimpse into another woman's life. There were no comfortable jeans or practical sweaters. Instead, there was a black silk cocktail dress, a pair of designer heels with impossibly high stilettos, and delicate lace lingerie. It was the wardrobe of a courtesan, a kept woman. Beneath the clothes my fingers found a small, sleek burner phone, the kind people use when they don't want their calls to be traced. Next to it was a thick envelope. I opened it. My eyes widened in disbelief. It was filled with cash, not dollars but euros. Crisp, clean 100-euro notes. There had to be several thousand euros in that stack. This was it, the irrefutable proof. The secret life packed neatly into a leather case, the designer clothes for the rendezvous, the untraceable phone for the secret calls, the foreign currency for the trips abroad. My daughter-in-law wasn't just having an affair, she was a professional, living a meticulously planned, well-funded double life. I felt a wave of nausea and fury wash over me. I thought of my son Daniel working tirelessly at his firm to build a future for his family, completely oblivious to this profound betrayal. I thought of Sam, my sweet, innocent grandson, being cared for by a paid imposter while his mother gallivanted across the globe with her wealthy lover. I closed the suitcase, my mind racing. I had found the truth, but now, holding the evidence in my hands, a new and more terrifying question emerged. What on earth was I going to do with it? The quiet of the house was shattered by the sound of the garage door opening. She was back. My heart leaped into my throat. Panicked, I shoved the suitcase back into its hiding place, pushing the coats in front of it. My movements clumsy and loud. I hurried out of the closet, my heart pounding just as her footsteps started up the stairs. I had to confront her, Leo's warning be damned. I couldn't pretend for another second. I met her at the top of the stairs, my face a mask of cold fury. I held up the burner phone, which I had slipped into my pocket. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a rage I could no longer contain. The woman's face, which had been set in a pleasant, placid expression, crumpled. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and terrified. The sweet domestic facade dissolved, replaced by the raw, undisguised panic of someone who has been caught. "Where did you get that?" she stammered, her eyes darting from the phone to my face. "In a suitcase full of designer clothes and foreign currency hidden in the back of the storage closet," I said, my voice like ice. "Who are you, and where is Isabel?" She backed away from me, shaking her head, her hands held up in a gesture of surrender. I can't," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't understand. Please, you have to put it back. Forget you saw it." "Forget?" I took a step toward her, my anger making me bold. "You are in my son's house pretending to be his wife, taking care of my grandson, and you want me to forget? You will tell me what is going on right now. No, please, she begged, her voice breaking into a sob. She'll kill me. You can't tell anyone. Please, you'll ruin everything. Her fear was so genuine, so absolute. It stopped me in my tracks. She wasn't the mastermind of this deception. She was a pawn, just as I was. She was terrified of the real Isabel. Her panic confirmed everything. She was the stand-in, the poor double hired to play a role. And she had just been caught off script. The confrontation had failed to give me the answers I wanted, but it had given me something else. A confirmation of her role as a terrified accomplice, and a chilling new understanding of the woman who was really in charge. The threat came the next day. I was in the garden trying to find a moment of peace among my roses, my mind still reeling from the imposter's panicked reaction. My personal cell phone, the one I rarely used, rang with a number I didn't recognize. An international code. My hand trembled as I answered. The voice on the other end was Isabel's, but it was a version of her I had never heard before. All the warmth, the sweetness, the gentle melody of her tone was gone, stripped away, leaving behind a voice that was as cold and sharp as surgical steel. You went through my things. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact delivered with chilling authority. The imposter in the house must have called her on the burner phone, her panic bleeding across the transatlantic line. Isabel, you need to come home, I said, my own voice shaking. We need to talk about this, Daniel. We are not going to talk about anything. She cut me off, her voice dangerously calm. You are going to listen. You will go to that closet, you will put that suitcase back exactly where you found it, and you will forget everything you saw. You will not breathe a word of this to Daniel. You will not speak to Leo about it. You will go back to being the sweet, doting grandmother, and you will keep your mouth shut. The sheer arrogance, the absolute command in her voice took my breath away. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't afraid. She was angry that her perfect secret world had been disturbed. I can't do that, Isabel, I said, a surge of defiant anger rising in me. This is my family you are destroying. You think this is a game? She hissed, the cold calm finally cracking to reveal the venom beneath. Let me make it very clear to you, Sarah. I know how much you love Sam. He is everything to you. If you breathe a single word of this to Daniel, if you do anything to ruin the life I have built, I will disappear, and I will take my son with me. You will never see your grandson again. Do you understand me? The threat hung in the air, a perfectly aimed arrow striking me in my most vulnerable place. Sam, she was using my own grandson as a hostage. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She would tear her own child away from his father, his home and the grandmother who adored him, all to protect her web of lies. I stood in the sun-drenched garden, surrounded by the beauty of my roses, and felt a chill colder than any winter wind. This was the real Isabel. Not the charming daughter-in-law I thought I knew, but a ruthless, selfish woman who would burn her own family to the ground to keep her secrets safe. Do you understand me? She repeated, her voice a silken threat. Yes, I whispered, the word a bitter taste of defeat in my mouth. I understand. Good, she said, and the line went dead. I sank onto a nearby garden bench, the phone slipping from my nerveless fingers. I was trapped. She had checkmated me with a single brutal move. I now knew the full extent of her deception, but I was powerless to reveal it. To save my grandson, I had to become a keeper of the secret myself, a silent accomplice to the very betrayal that was tearing my family apart. The threat from Isabel had paralyzed me with fear, but it had also ignited a desperate burning need for answers. I couldn't fight her without understanding the whole truth, without knowing who the woman in my house was. My mind kept returning to the hidden suitcase. Tucked away in a small zippered side pocket, I had found something besides the cash and the burner phone. A worn, creased photograph. It was an old, faded color print from the early 90s. In it, two little girls, no older than 7 or 8, stood in front of a small, rundown house. They were identical in every way, from their matching floral dresses, to their wide, dark eyes and the missing front tooth in each of their smiles. They were unmistakably twins. I remembered Isabel telling me, years ago, that she had grown up poor in a small, dusty agricultural town in the Central Valley. She rarely spoke of her childhood, always dismissing it as something she had been happy to escape. The house in the photograph, with its peeling paint and patchy lawn, fit the description. Driven by a desperate last-ditch hope, I decided to go there. I needed to find that house. I needed to know who the other girl in the photograph was. I told the imposter I was visiting an old friend who was ill, a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth. I got in my car and made the 3-hour drive east, away from the coastal breeze and into the flat sun-baked landscape of the Central Valley. The address on the back of the photograph, scrawled in a child's loopy cursive, was my only guide. The town was just as Isabel had described it, small, tired and shimmering in the afternoon heat. The address led me to a street of modest single-story homes, many in a state of disrepair, and then I saw it. The house from the photograph. It looked even smaller and more run down in person, the paint almost completely gone, the yard a patchwork of dry dirt and weeds. My heart pounded against my ribs as I walked up the cracked concrete path. What was I doing here? What did I expect to find? I raised my hand and knocked on the peeling wooden door. For a long moment there was no answer. Then the door creaked open and I found myself staring at a ghost. The woman who stood before me was the exact image of my daughter-in-law, but this version was worn down, exhausted, her face etched with lines of worry that the Isabel I knew had never worn. Her clothes were simple and faded, and her hands were rough, the hands of someone who worked hard. This was the woman who had been living in my house. She stared at me, her eyes widening in shock and recognition. You're Daniel's mother," she stammered. I held up the photograph of the two little girls. Her gaze dropped to it, and a look of profound, heartbreaking sadness washed over her face. "Please," I said, my voice gentle, "I just want to understand." She hesitated for a moment, then seemed to deflate, all the tension going out of her. She stepped back and opened the door wider. A silent invitation. Her name was Annalise. As we sat in her small, sparsely furnished living room, the whole sordid story came pouring out of her in a torrent of guilt and desperation. She and Isabel were identical twins, separated not by choice but by the cruelty of circumstance. Isabel, the more ambitious and ruthless of the two, had escaped their life of poverty, reinventing herself and never looking back. Annalise had stayed, burdened by her aging parents and their crushing medical debt. A year ago, Isabel had reappeared in her life, not for a family reunion but with a business proposition. She needed a stand-in, someone to cover for her at home for a few days each month while she traveled for work. She had spun a tale of a demanding job that required international travel she couldn't tell Daniel about. "I knew it was wrong," Annalise whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But my father needed surgery. We couldn't afford." Isabel offered me money. Not a lot, but enough to help. She said it was just for a little while. I never knew about the other man. I swear it. I just thought she was working. She was not a villain. She was a victim, trapped by her love for her family and exploited by the cold cruelty of her own twin sister. Isabel hadn't just found a convenient look-alike. She had weaponized her sister's poverty and desperation for her own selfish gain. I sat there, the full, ugly truth finally laid bare, and my heart broke. It broke for my son, for my grandson, and for this poor, lost woman, who had been forced to wear her sister's face and live her sister's lie. My fear was gone, burned away by a cold, hard rage. Isabel hadn't just betrayed her husband. She had betrayed everyone, including the sister who shared her face. I knew then that I couldn't keep this secret. The threat against my grandson was terrifying, but the truth was a force of nature that could no longer be contained. I had to bring it all into the light. I returned from the Central Valley with a heavy heart, but a will of steel. The fear Isabel had instilled in me was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. This was no longer just about her betrayal of Daniel. It was about her monstrous exploitation of her own sister. The deception had to end, not just for my family but for Annalise as well. The first person I called was Leo. I found a quiet park a few miles from my house and told him everything, the twin sister Annalise. The story of their family's poverty, the medical debt, Isabel's cruel proposition. He listened in stunned silence. The occasional sharp intake of breath, the only sound on his end of the line. "So she's been using her own sister as a cover," he said, finally, his voice low and filled with a disgusted disbelief. "That's monstrous." "It is," I confirmed, "and she threatened me, Leo. She told me if I said anything to Daniel she would take Sam and disappear." "She can't do that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew Isabel was ruthless enough to try. "We can't let her win," I said, my voice firm. "We can't let her keep doing this to Daniel, to Sam and to Annalise. We need a plan. We need to expose her, but we have to do it in a way that she can't run." Together on that park bench, we devised a strategy. It was risky, dramatic, and felt like something out of a movie, but it was the only way we could see to control the fallout and ensure Sam's safety. We would force a confrontation, but on our terms, in our home. The first step was to get Annalise on our side. I drove back to her small house in the valley, this time not as an investigator but as an ally. I told her about Isabel's threat to take Sam. "She is using your silence to hold my grandson hostage, Annalise," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I know you're scared of her, but you are the key to stopping this. For Sam's sake, you have to be brave. You have to be there." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of resolve. The thought of a little boy being used as a pawn was the final push she needed. She agreed to help. She told me Isabel was due back from her latest trip in 2 days. The stage was set. I called Daniel and told him I wanted to have a special family dinner the following night. I invented a reason, a small celebration for a project he had recently completed at his firm. He was pleased and readily agreed, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his head. The day of the dinner, the air in the house was thick with a tension only I could feel. The real Isabel was back, having swapped places with Annalise in the early morning hours. She was in full performance mode, playing the part of the perfect doting wife. She kissed Daniel as he came through the door, asked Sam about his day at school, and complimented me on the aroma of the roast chicken coming from the oven. She was radiant, confident and completely unaware that her world was about to come to an end. We sat down at the dining room table, a perfect picture of a happy family. Daniel was talking about his work. Sam was chattering about a field trip, and Isabel was smiling, laughing and playing her part to perfection. My heart ached for my son, for the devastation he was about to face. As dinner wound down, I took a deep breath and began. "Isabel dear," I started, my voice calm and even. "I've been noticing some odd things lately. The other day, for example, you were struggling to use the can opener with your right hand." Isabel's smile tightened. "I told you, Sarah, I was just exercising my brain. And then there was the handbag," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "The one you said you bought with lottery winnings." I was waiting for the right moment to surprise Daniel. She insisted, her eyes starting to flash with annoyance. Daniel looked from her to me, a confused frown on his face. "What handbag?" Before Isabel could answer, Leo, who had arrived just after Daniel, spoke up. He slid a folder across the table. "Maybe it was the handbag you bought on your trip to Paris last week, Isabel." He opened the folder. Inside were copies of flight records in her name, and a discreetly taken photo on his phone. It showed Isabel and a handsome silver-haired man sitting at a sidewalk cafe, a bottle of champagne between them. They were laughing, their heads close together. Isabel stared at the photo, her face turning ashen. Daniel looked at it, his own face crumbling with a slow dawning horror. "What is this?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "Who is that man?" Isabel jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Her composure finally shattered, revealing the furious cornered animal beneath. "How dare you?" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly sound. "You've been spying on me. You are trying to ruin our marriage." She turned on me, her eyes blazing with hatred. "This is your doing, you meddling old woman." And at that exact chaotic moment, as her screams filled the room, Annalise walked quietly in from the kitchen, where she had been waiting with Leo. The screaming stopped. The world seemed to stop. Daniel froze, his fork clattering from his hand onto his plate. He stared, his eyes wide with utter mind-bending disbelief, at the two identical women. One, his wife dressed in an elegant silk blouse, her face contorted with rage. The other a stranger, dressed in a simple cotton dress, her face a mask of sorrow and shame. "What is happening?" Daniel breathed, looking back and forth between them. Cornered, exposed, and with her entire web of lies irrevocably destroyed, Isabel's rage turned to pure, undiluted venom. The mask didn't just slip, she ripped it off and threw it to the ground. "You want to know what's happening?" she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt as she pointed a trembling finger at Annalise. "I'll tell you what's happening. I got tired of this boring, pathetic life. I got tired of being married to a man with no ambition, who was content to rot in this cookie-cutter house in this pathetic little suburb. She gestured toward the photo of her lover, "gives me a life you couldn't even dream of. Daniel, and you," she spat the word at Annalise, "were my ticket out. A cheap, pathetic replacement for a cheap, pathetic life." Her vicious words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. The truth was finally out. Not in a quiet confession but in an explosive tirade of cruelty and hate. And we were all left standing in the rubble. In the shocking, ringing silence that followed Isabel's confession, the illusion of our family life was shattered beyond repair. Daniel was a statue, his face a canvas of utter devastation, the healthy color drained away, leaving a waxy, pallid sheen under the warm lights of the dining room. His eyes were fixed on the woman who was his wife. But he wasn't seeing her, he was seeing the chasm that had just opened up at his feet. A gaping wound in the very center of his world. The hand that had held his fork moments before was now clenched into a white-knuckled fist on the tablecloth, the only part of him that seemed alive. Sam, my grandson, was the first to break the spell. The raw, venomous hatred in his mother's voice had finally pierced his childlike innocence. He didn't understand the words, adultery, ambition, deception, but he understood the tone. He heard the violence in her voice. A heart-wrenching sob escaped his small chest. A sound of pure, unadulterated fear. He scrambled off his chair and ran, not to his father who was lost in his own private hell, and not to the woman who had just revealed herself as a monster, but to me. He buried his face in my lap, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Grandma, he wept, his voice muffled by the fabric of my dress. Why is Mommy so angry? Why is she yelling? I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him close, my own tears starting to fall. I stroked his hair, murmuring nonsensical words of comfort, my heart splintering into 1,000 pieces for him, for this innocent child caught in the shrapnel of his parents' imploding life. My movement seemed to animate the others. Annalise, who had been frozen by the doorway, took a hesitant step forward. Her face was a portrait of misery and guilt. Daniel, she whispered, her voice cracking. I am so sorry. I never knew. Don't you dare speak to him, Isabel snarled, turning her fury on her sister. You pathetic little fool. You think you're a victim. You were a willing participant. You took my money for Daddy's surgery. Annalise cried, a flash of spirit returning to her. You know that. Details, Isabel said with a dismissive wave of her hand, her eyes cold and hard as river stones, landed back on Daniel. The rage had subsided, replaced by a chilling reptilian calm. She looked at the wreckage she had created not with remorse, but with a kind of detached satisfaction, as if she were a demolition expert admiring her handiwork. Well, she said, her voice light, almost conversational, I suppose this frees me from having to pretend any longer. She turned and walked, not ran, from the dining room. There was no shame in her stride, only an arrogant, purposeful grace. We heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the sound of closet doors opening and closing in the master bedroom upstairs. She was not fleeing. She was packing. Daniel finally moved. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He walked like a man in a trance to the bottom of the staircase and looked up. Isabel, he called, and the name that had once been a term of endearment was now just a sound, a question mark filled with a pain so profound it was almost physical. Don't bother, she called down, her voice echoing from the bedroom. I'll be gone in 10 minutes. I'm taking my things, the real things. I mean, not the cheap suburban crap you filled this house with. Each word was a deliberate twist of the knife. I could see my son flinch, could see the final vestiges of hope dying in his eyes. He had been a good husband, a loving father, he had given her everything he had, and she was telling him it was all worthless. True to her word, she appeared at the top of the stairs less than 10 minutes later. She was pulling the expensive leather carry-on, the one I had found in the closet, and her designer handbag was slung over her shoulder. She had changed out of her dinner clothes and was now wearing a chic, tailored travel outfit. She looked like she was heading to the airport for another one of her glamorous trysts, not walking out on her family forever. She descended the stairs, her heels clicking a sharp final rhythm on the oak steps. She didn't look at me or Annalise. She paused at the bottom, her gaze falling on Daniel. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something regret. Perhaps, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold, appraising look. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. He'll handle the divorce. I don't want anything from you. Not the house. Not a penny. Richard can give me more than you could ever earn in 100 lifetimes. Daniel said nothing. He just stared at her, his face a mask of betrayal. What about Sam? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. I held my grandson tighter. What about your son? Isabel finally looked at Sam, who was peeking out from behind my legs. his face tear-streaked and confused. Her expression was unreadable. It was not the look of a mother abandoning her child, but of a strategist assessing a liability. "He'll be better off here," she said, the words sharp and clinical. "He's part of this life, the life I'm leaving behind. He wouldn't fit into my new one." She looked at Daniel. "You can have him, full custody. I won't fight you on it." And with that final devastating act of cruelty, she turned her back on her son. She walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the night without a backward glance. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more painful than any screaming could ever be. The first night was a descent into a quiet, frozen hell. After the front door closed, a profound and heavy silence settled over the house, a silence thick with unspoken grief and the ghosts of what had just been destroyed. Daniel remained standing at the foot of the stairs for what felt like an eternity, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the door that had closed on his entire world. Leo, who had been a silent, grim-faced witness to the entire confrontation, was the first to act. He walked over to Daniel and put a hand on his shoulder. "Dan," he said softly, "come on. Let's go sit down." Daniel didn't seem to hear him. He was lost, adrift in the immediate shocking aftermath. Annalise stood near the dining room entrance, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, tears streaming silently down her face. She looked at the devastated man who was her brother-in-law, at the weeping child who was her nephew, and the weight of her unwitting complicity seemed to crush her. My focus was on Sam. His sobs had quieted into hiccuping, exhausted whimpers. He was still clinging to me, his small body a bundle of confusion and fear. "Is Mommy coming back?" he whispered, his voice tiny and raw. My heart shattered all over again. "Let's get you to bed, sweet pea," I said, my own voice thick with unshed tears. I scooped him into my arms, his warm weight, a comfort and a terrible burden. He was so small, so innocent. How could we ever explain this to him? As I carried him upstairs, I could hear Leo's low, steady voice trying to coax Daniel into the living room. I walked past the master bedroom. The door was ajar. I could see the chaos Isabel had left in her wake. Drawers pulled open, empty hangers strewn on the bed, a stray shoe lying on the floor. It was the only tangible evidence that she had ever been here. The room already felt cold, abandoned. Putting Sam to bed was an ordeal. He fought sleep, his little body tense with anxiety, as if he were afraid that if he closed his eyes more of his world would disappear. I sang him his favorite lullabies, the same ones I had sung to Daniel and Leo when they were boys. I lay beside him in his small bed, stroking his hair until his breathing finally deepened into the troubled sleep of a child who had seen too much. When I came back downstairs, the house was dark, except for a single lamp in the living room. Daniel was sitting on the sofa, staring into the middle distance, an empty glass on the table in front of him. Leo sat in the armchair opposite, watching his brother with a look of profound worry. Annalise was gone. "Where's Annalise?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "She tried to leave," Leo said, his voice low. "She said she couldn't stay here, that she had caused all this. I told her that was ridiculous, that she needed to stay at least for the night. She's in the guest room. I don't think she's doing too well." I nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. I sat down on the other end of the sofa from Daniel. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He just sat there, a shell of a man, his spirit extinguished. We sat like that for hours, the three of us in a silent vigil of grief. The clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes, each one a small metallic reminder of the time that was now stretching out before us, a future that was suddenly a terrifying, empty unknown. The days that followed were a blur of hollow routines and heavy silence. The house, once a place of bustling family life, felt like a mausoleum. Daniel moved through it like a ghost, his face a constant mask of numb disbelief. He went to work, his movements mechanical, his eyes vacant. He would come home, eat the dinner I prepared without tasting it, and then retreat to his office, where he would sit for hours staring at blueprints that he wasn't seeing. He refused to talk about what had happened. Any attempt I made to broach the subject was met with a wall of silence. He was building a fortress around his pain, and I didn't have the strength to break it down. I could only watch, my heart aching, as my son disappeared into his grief. Annalise was a quiet, sorrowful presence in the house. True to Leo's prediction, she had tried to leave the morning after the confrontation. I found her in the hallway with her small worn bag, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I can't stay," she whispered, her voice choked with guilt. Every time Daniel looks at me he's going to see her. I'm a reminder of the lie. I'm just making it worse. You are not making it worse, I told her, my voice firmer than I felt. I took her hand. It was cold and trembling. You are not her, Annalise. You are the furthest thing from her, and right now Sam needs you. The mention of Sam made her pause. He's traumatized, I continued, my voice softening. He keeps asking for his mommy. He doesn't understand that there were two. To him, the kind, gentle mother who knew the name of his dinosaur and gave the right kind of hugs was real. That was you. He needs that kindness right now. Daniel is lost in his own world, and I'm just trying to hold things together. Please, Annalise, don't go. Stay. Not for Daniel. Not for me. Stay for Sam. She looked at me, her eyes swimming with a mixture of pain and compassion. She finally gave a small, defeated nod. She stayed, and she was a godsend. While Daniel was lost in his grief, Annalise became Sam's anchor. She was endlessly patient with his confusion and his outbursts of anger and sadness. When he would wake from nightmares, screaming for his mommy, she would be the one to go to him, to hold him and soothe him back to sleep. She remembered that his favorite dinosaur was named Rex. She knew that he liked his sandwiches cut into triangles, not squares. She knew all the small, intimate details that Isabel had never bothered to learn. The details that Annalise had absorbed during her short, reluctant time as an imposter. She was slowly, carefully piecing together the broken fragments of my grandson's heart, and for that I was eternally grateful. She and I formed a silent, unspoken alliance. Two women trying to navigate the wreckage, our days revolving around the well-being of a little boy and the broken man who was his father. The legal formalities were swift and brutal. About a week after Isabel had left, a sleek, black car pulled up to the house. A man in a sharp suit delivered a set of papers. They were the divorce filings. Isabel had been ruthlessly efficient. Daniel took the papers without a word and retreated to his office. He told me about it later, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She signed away her parental rights, he said, staring at the wall. There was a form, a voluntary relinquishment of custody. Her lawyer said she wanted a clean break. No alimony, no division of assets, no custody battle. She just wants to be gone. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a hollow, deadened pain. She didn't just leave us, Mom. She erased us. It's like we never even existed. The months crawled by, each day a small, painful step away from the night the world had ended. Autumn bled into winter and the house remained a place of quiet sorrow. Daniel's grief was a persistent low-grade fever, a constant presence that colored every aspect of his life. He was functional, but he was not living. He was a man going through the motions, his laughter gone, his spirit shrouded in a fog of betrayal. Annalise was the quiet, steady light in our shared darkness. She had seamlessly, selflessly taken on the role of caregiver for both Daniel and Sam. She made sure Daniel ate, that his work shirts were clean, that the house didn't fall into disrepair. More importantly, she was the gravitational center of Sam's universe. She helped him with his kindergarten homework, took him to the park, and patiently answered his increasingly difficult questions about his mother. Why did Mommy leave? He asked her one afternoon as they were building a Lego tower in the living room. I was in the kitchen, but I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, waiting to hear her answer. Sometimes, sweet pea, Annalise said, her voice gentle and calm. Grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand. Your mommy had to go away, but it was never ever because of you. You are a wonderful, amazing boy, and she loved you very much in her own way. It was a masterful answer, a delicate balance of truth and kindness, designed to protect a child's fragile heart. I saw in that moment that her goodness, her empathy was as profound and innate as Isabel's selfishness. Daniel's thaw began so gradually it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't a single event, but a series of small, quiet moments. It started with him noticing. I would see him watching Annalise as she laughed with Sam, a flicker of something other than pain in his eyes. He started to linger in the kitchen while she was cooking, not speaking much, but just being present in the same space. One evening I found them in the living room after Sam had gone to bed. They were sitting on the sofa, a photo album open between them. It was one of Sam's baby albums. Annalise was pointing to a picture, a small, genuine smile on her face. He looks so much like you here, she said softly. Daniel looked at the photo, and for the first time in months I saw the ghost of a real smile touch his lips. He has my eyes, he said, his voice quiet. But he has a good heart. It was a slip, a moment of unguarded honesty. He had almost said, he has your smile, because Annalise's smile was the same as Isabel's, but he had corrected himself, focusing not on the face but on the soul. He was beginning to see Annalise not as a reflection of the woman who had betrayed him but as her own person, the woman who was a constant gentle presence in the wreckage of his life. The turning point came on a cold, rainy Saturday in February. Sam woke up with a high fever and a hacking cough. He was miserable, crying and clinging to Annalise. Daniel, who had planned to go into the office to catch up on work, immediately cancelled his plans. For the first time since Isabel had left, he was fully present, his focus entirely on his sick son. The three of us spent the day tag-teaming, trying to comfort a feverish, unhappy little boy, but it was Annalise who was the true source of solace. She sat with Sam for hours, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth, reading him stories in a soft, soothing voice, and managing to coax him into drinking sips of water and eating a few bites of toast. That evening, after Sam had finally fallen into a fever-diminished sleep, Daniel and Annalise were in the kitchen, cleaning up. I was in the living room, pretending to read, but I was watching them. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice low and filled with an emotion I hadn't heard in a long time. "Gratitude, for today, for everything. I don't know what we would have done without you." Annalise looked up from the sink, her hands still in the soapy water. "He's my nephew, Daniel," she said simply. "I love him. Of course I would be here." "I know," he said, taking a step closer. "But you didn't have to be. After everything Isabel did to you, you could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." "I couldn't," she said, her voice a whisper. "Leaving you and Sam in the middle of all this, that felt like something she would do. I had to be different." He stood there, looking at her, and in that moment, I saw the walls around his heart finally begin to crumble. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the kind, selfless and deeply decent woman she was. He was seeing the woman who had stayed, the woman who had healed, the woman who had loved his son with a sincerity his wife had never been capable of. He was falling in love, not with a face but with a soul. A few weeks after that rainy Saturday, a thought that had been nagging at me finally coalesced into a plan. Annalise's presence in our lives was a gift, but it was born from a place of terrible hardship. The reason she had agreed to Isabel's monstrous plan in the first place was her parents' medical debt. I found Daniel in his office sketching at his drafting table. He seemed more engaged, more like his old self in the past few weeks. The fog was lifting. "Daniel," I began, sitting in the chair opposite his desk. "I want to talk to you about Annalise's parents." He put his pencil down and gave me his full attention. I explained what I knew about their situation, about the surgery her father had needed, and how Isabel had used that desperation as a lever to control her. "She's done so much for us," I finished, my voice thick with emotion. "She's been our rock. It doesn't feel right that her family is still struggling because of a choice she was forced to make to save them." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said finally. "It's not right at all." The next weekend he asked Annalise for her parents' address and phone number, telling her he wanted to send them a proper thank you card for raising such a wonderful daughter. A few days later he came to me, a determined look on his face. He had spoken to the hospital, to the collection agencies. He had a full picture of their financial burden. That Saturday he asked Annalise if she would take a drive with him and Sam. He didn't tell her where they were going. I stayed behind, my heart filled with a nervous hope. They were gone all day. When they returned late that evening, the atmosphere in the car was quiet, but it was a comfortable, peaceful quiet. Sam was asleep in the back, a happy, tired smile on his face. Annalise's eyes were shining with unshed tears, but they were not tears of sadness. She told me about it later, her voice filled with a quiet awe. Daniel had driven them to her parents' little house in the Central Valley. He had introduced himself and Sam, and then, sitting in their small, worn living room, he had presented her father with a cashier's check that covered the entirety of their remaining medical debt. "My son told me," Annalise's father had said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Daniel, "that he had a wonderful mother. I see now that he has found her again." Daniel had simply said, "Your daughter saved my family, sir. It's the least I could do to thank her." On the drive home, after a long, comfortable silence, Annalise had turned to him. "You didn't have to do that, Daniel." "Yes, I did," he replied, his eyes on the road but his voice full of a meaning that went far beyond money. I wanted to finally sever the last tie you had to her, to that whole nightmare. I wanted you to be free. She had started to cry then, quiet, grateful tears. And he had reached over and taken her hand, holding it for the rest of the drive home. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, it was something better. It was a promise of safety, of partnership, of a future built not on lies, but on mutual kindness and a shared, hard-won peace. The final remnants of winter gave way to a gentle, hopeful spring. The world outside was coming back to life, and so was our little family. The heavy shroud of grief that had hung over our home for so long was finally beginning to lift, replaced by something lighter, warmer, and infinitely more real than the polished facade we had lived with before. The love that grew between Daniel and Annalise was a quiet, sturdy thing, like an oak tree taking root. It wasn't a passionate whirlwind romance. It was built on a foundation of shared experience, mutual respect, and a deep abiding affection that was evident in 1,000 small gestures. It was in the way he would make her a cup of tea, just the way she liked it, without her having to ask. It was in the way she would put a hand on his shoulder as she passed his desk, a silent gesture of support. It was in the shared smiles they exchanged over Sam's head, a secret language of love and understanding that belonged only to them. Sam was the heart of their bond. Watching Annalise with him, Daniel saw not an imitation of a mother but the very definition of one. She was the one who cheered the loudest at his t-ball games, the one who patiently helped him sound out words as he learned to read, the one whose hugs were a safe harbor in any storm. He wasn't just falling for Annalise, he was falling for the family she was helping him rebuild. The story ends, not with a grand proposal or a dramatic wedding, but a year after the night the world fell apart. It was a warm, sunny Saturday in late autumn. Sam's 6th birthday. We were in the backyard, the same yard where Isabel had once pretended to garden, but today, there were no pretenses. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the smoky aroma of burgers on the grill. Daniel, wearing a flour-dusted apron over his jeans, was at the barbecue, a genuine relaxed smile on his face that I hadn't seen in years. He was laughing, a real deep laugh that reached his eyes, as he playfully dodged a squirt from Sam's water gun. Annalise was setting up a small table with a brightly colored tablecloth, a homemade birthday cake sitting in the center. She was wearing a simple sundress, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and she glowed with a quiet, contented happiness. She caught my eye and smiled, a look of such profound shared understanding passing between us that it brought tears to my eyes. Leo was there, having flown in specially for the occasion. He was engaged in a mock sword fight with Sam, using wrapping paper tubes as their weapons. The yard was filled with the sounds of their laughter, a joyous, carefree sound that had been absent from our lives for too long. I sat on the patio steps, a glass of iced tea in my hand, and I watched them. I watched my son Daniel, reborn from the ashes of a terrible betrayal, find a love that was true and kind. I watched Annalise, a woman who had been a victim of cruelty, find a home and a family that cherished her for exactly who she was. And I watched my grandson Sam, a happy, secure, and deeply loved little boy, who now had a mother whose hugs were always just the right amount of squeezy, and who always remembered the name of his favorite dinosaur. The storm had passed. It had been a hurricane, one that had ripped our world down to its foundations. But in its wake, we had rebuilt. We were not the same family we had been before. We were stronger, more honest, more grateful. The life Isabel had sneered at as boring and pathetic was, in fact, rich and beautiful in its simplicity. It was a life built, not on glamorous lies and expensive things, but on the quiet, unbreakable bonds of love, loyalty, and a hard-won, honest peace. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the happy scene in my backyard, my heart was finally truly full.